Grayson Holt had been a taxi driver for years. It wasn't a glamorous job by any means, but it paid the bills, and he'd gotten used to the quiet, late-night hours. The world seemed to slow down after midnight, and driving along the empty streets became almost comforting. He knew every corner, every pothole, and every dark alley by heart. But lately, something had been eating at him, a feeling he couldn't shake, like he wasn't in full control of his own actions. It had always been a simple routine. Pick up passengers, drop them off, wait for the next ride. But over time, the rules seemed to change. There were certain people he could pick up, people who appeared on the street at specific times, in specific places. And then there were the others, the ones who never made it into his cab. He didn't ask questions. He didn't want to. The rules were the rules, and as long as he followed them, everything was fine. At least, that's what he told himself. Tonight, though, something felt off. The usual calm wasn't there. The streets seemed quieter than usual, the night air heavier. His headlights cast long shadows across the empty road as he drove, a dull hum filling the silence inside the cab. Grayson glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was almost midnight, another hour before his shift ended, but already he felt a sense of unease creeping in. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about tonight that felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The rules had never been more obvious, more suffocating than they were now. Grayson had learned over the years that his job wasn't just about picking up passengers. It was about following an invisible set of guidelines. Guidelines he didn't fully understand but had always followed without question. He couldn't pick up just anyone. It wasn't up to him. There were certain people he could take, and there were others who never even seemed to show up, no matter how many times he drove down the same stretch of road. It was a strange feeling, knowing that his life wasn't entirely his own, that there were forces at work, forces he didn't understand and didn't want to. But that was the job, and he had been doing it for years. He'd never questioned it before. He didn't want to, now. As Grayson turned the corner onto another empty street, he spotted a figure in the distance. A woman standing alone on the sidewalk, her coat pulled tightly around her. She was looking down at the ground, her posture stiff, as if she were waiting. Grayson's heart skipped a beat. It was the middle of the night. People didn't stand alone on deserted streets at this hour. He slowed the car, instinctively preparing to pass by. But then, as if on cue, the woman looked up. She locked eyes with him, her gaze piercing through the windshield. Grayson felt an odd shiver run through him, but he didn't know why. Something about her was different. Grayson's hand hovered over the door handle for a moment before he reluctantly pulled over. The rules had always been clear. When someone appeared at the right time and place, they were meant to get in. He didn't question it. He couldn't. The woman opened the door and slid into the back seat without a word. Grayson glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his throat tightening. She was staring straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face was calm, almost too calm. It felt like she wasn't really there, like she was a part of the night itself, a shadow that had somehow materialized out of nowhere. "Where to?" Grayson asked, his voice sounding strangely distant in his own ears. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, sat, her face still hidden in the shadow of the seat. "You can't escape the rules, Grayson," she said softly. Grayson's heart skipped a beat. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it hit him like a cold gust of wind. He hadn't told her his name. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. "What do you mean?" But she didn't respond. Instead, she just sat there, her body stiff, like she was waiting for something. The silence in the cab grew heavier, suffocating. Grayson's eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror, but she didn't move. Her presence was almost overwhelming, as if she were taking up all the space in the car. I'm just doing my job," Grayson muttered to himself, trying to shake the sense of unease that was crawling up his spine. But she spoke again, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "You can't escape the rules, not tonight." Grayson's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Something was wrong. This wasn't just another passenger. Something about her was off, unnatural. He turned down another street, trying to focus on the road, but it felt like the world outside had faded away. The city lights blurred together, the street signs meaningless. The only thing that mattered was the woman sitting in the back of his cab and the strange, unsettling feeling that had taken hold of him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the woman spoke again, her voice distant and cold. "You'll see more than you bargained for." Grayson didn't know what she meant, but it was too late to ask. He didn't know what was happening, but he felt like he was being pulled into something he couldn't escape. Something that had always been there, lurking in the dark corners of his life. Before he could say anything, the woman opened the door and stepped out. She didn't say goodbye. She just walked away, her figure fading into the darkness. Grayson stared after her, his mind racing. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. But the night felt different now. The rules, the strange pull of the car, the eerie sense of unease. It was all too real. Grayson knew that something had just changed. Something had shifted in a way he couldn't understand. He glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping for a glimpse of something familiar, something that would ground him. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty road behind him. And then, just as he was about to drive off, something caught his eye. A shadow. It was quick, too quick, but it was there, a dark shape that hadn't been there before. Grayson's heart leapt in his chest as his foot slammed on the brake. He twisted around, searching the back seat for any sign of movement. But it was empty. The car hummed loudly now, as though it were alive, as though it were feeding off the fear that had taken root in his chest. Grayson's pulse was racing, and the night outside felt colder than ever. Something was watching him. As he drove away, the shadow in the rearview mirror lingered in his mind. Who was that woman? What did she mean? And why did it feel like he was already trapped, caught in the grip of something he couldn't control? The road ahead seemed endless, but Grayson knew one thing for sure. He was no longer driving the car. The car was driving him. The road stretched endlessly ahead of Grayson as his mind raced. The hum of the car seemed louder than ever, vibrating through the steering wheel and into his bones. His eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow from earlier, but the seat was empty. The streetlights outside blurred into streaks of yellow, as though the world itself was slipping away, becoming less real with every turn. Grayson swallowed hard. He couldn't shake the thought of that woman, Celine Ward. What had she meant by her cryptic words? "You can't escape the rules." His hands tightened on the wheel. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't wanted to be a part of something that felt so wrong. Just as he was trying to push the thoughts from his mind, a figure appeared in the distance, standing on the curb by the next intersection. Grayson slowed the car, barely registering his surroundings as he pulled over. He wasn't sure why he did it. He had no real choice. Not anymore. The rules controlled him, and he had learned long ago to follow them. The man who climbed into the cab was tall, thin, with dark hair and a face that seemed almost too perfect. Sharp features that were unsettling in their stillness. He didn't say a word at first, just slid into the back seat and stared out the window. Grayson glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but quickly turned his eyes back to the road. There was something about this passenger, something that didn't feel right. The man's name, as it turned out, was Dorian Vance. But he didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. Grayson could tell right away that Dorian wasn't like any other passenger he'd had before. There was an eerie calmness about him, like he knew things that no one else could know. His eyes didn't meet Grayson's, but somehow they felt like they were always looking right through him. The silence in the cab grew thick, suffocating. Grayson's heart beat a little faster, but he forced himself to focus on the road. "Where to?" he asked, his voice shaky, not wanting to acknowledge the dread that was starting to settle in his chest. Dorian didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, his head resting against the seat, his eyes still fixed somewhere in the distance. Grayson glanced at him again, a chill running down his spine. There was something about the way Dorian was sitting, so still, so unnervingly still. It didn't feel like he was just another passenger. Finally, Dorian spoke, his voice low, almost too soft to hear. "You don't understand, do you?" he asked, the words coming slowly, as though they were carefully measured. "You think you're in control of your life. You think you make the choices, but you don't. Your fate was written a long time ago. All of this?" He gestured vaguely at the road ahead, his fingers curling into the air. It's already set. You're not driving, Grayson. You never were. Grayson's hands clenched on the wheel, but he didn't say anything. He didn't know what to say. The air inside the cab felt colder now, and the humming of the car seemed to vibrate even more intensely, as though it were somehow alive, drawing them forward. Dorian continued to speak, his words becoming more cryptic with each sentence. You see, the rules are not just for you. They're for all of us. Everyone who's caught in the web. You think you're special, but you're just another piece of the puzzle. Grayson's head spun, 1,000 questions flooding his mind. Who was this man? What was he talking about? The idea of fate, of not being in control of his life, seemed impossible to grasp. And yet, the way Dorian spoke, like he knew things Grayson couldn't even begin to understand, made his stomach twist in knots. The cab seemed to grow darker, the world outside becoming less real. Grayson's gaze flickered to the side, to the shadows creeping along the edges of the street, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something move. Something that wasn't human. Something that didn't belong. What are you talking about? Grayson managed to stammer, his throat dry, his voice barely above a whisper. Dorian's smile was small but unsettling. The void, he said simply. It's always watching. It's always there, pulling the strings, making sure the rules are followed. You're part of it now, Grayson, and there's no way out. The hair on the back of Grayson's neck stood on end. The void? He repeated, his mind struggling to wrap around the words. It sounded like something out of a nightmare. Dorian didn't answer at first. Instead, he turned his gaze to the window, his face growing distant. You're not the only one, you know, he said quietly. You're not the only one trapped by the rules. The Watchers are everywhere. You think you're alone, but they see you, Grayson. They're always watching, always waiting. Grayson's heart began to race. His grip on the steering wheel tightened to the point where his knuckles turned white. He didn't know what to think, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Dorian wasn't just some random passenger. There was something else, something dark behind his words, something that Grayson wasn't prepared to face. The ride stretched on, the world outside the cab blurring into nothingness. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch out and swallow the road. Grayson glanced nervously at Dorian, but the man didn't seem to notice. He was still, his expression unreadable, as though he were lost in thought, or perhaps lost in something else entirely. The coldness in the cab grew more intense, and Grayson felt a growing sense of unease. He wanted to stop the car, to get out, to run, but he couldn't. The rules wouldn't let him. The car was driving him, just as it had driven him to this point, and there was no escape. Finally, Dorian spoke again, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. You're being watched, Grayson, and you're not the only one who's trapped. The words hit Grayson like a slap. They echoed in his head, ringing louder and louder with each passing second. He looked at Dorian, but the man's face was calm, his smile unreadable. The cab slowed as they approached an empty street corner. Dorian didn't wait for Grayson to stop the car. Without a word, he opened the door and stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. Grayson watched as Dorian walked away, his figure blending into the shadows. The world outside felt still, as if time itself had paused. The streetlights flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. Grayson's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know why, but the street seemed different now. The air felt thicker, heavier. The moonlight that bathed the scene was strangely cold, casting everything in a pale, unearthly glow. He watched Dorian disappear into the night, but something about the street, something about the way reality seemed to warp around him, felt wrong. The fear settled in like a stone in his stomach. How many others were there? How many were trapped like him? And who or what was watching him? Grayson's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, the car's hum louder than ever in the silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer in control, that the car and the rules were driving him somewhere far darker than he could imagine. Grayson sat frozen in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his fingers started to ache. The weight of the night pressed in on him, and he could still hear the echo of Dorian's words in his head. You're being watched. And then, you're not the only one who's trapped. Every corner of his mind screamed for answers, but none came. The streetlights passed by, their pale glow like distant stars, casting long shadows over the road. The hum of the car seemed louder now, filling his ears, vibrating in his bones. It felt as if the world around him was slowly becoming something else, something darker, colder. The silence in the cab was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of his tires on the road. Grayson's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror again, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing, just empty space. Yet, a sense of being watched, of being followed, lingered in the air. His stomach turned, but before he could even consider stopping or pulling over, a figure appeared ahead. She was standing on the side of the road, her posture straight, her presence oddly calm despite the late hour. Grayson didn't know why he slowed, but he did. He pulled the car over without a second thought. The woman who climbed into the cab didn't speak right away. She just slid into the back seat, her eyes locking onto his through the rearview mirror. Her gaze was direct, too direct, as if she could see through him, straight into his soul. Grayson felt a chill run down his spine. Her eyes were an unsettling shade of green, almost glowing in the dim light, as if they held knowledge he couldn't begin to understand. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady, like she knew everything that was going to happen next. "You don't have to say anything," she said, her eyes never leaving him. "I already know what's happening to you." Grayson's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say to that. It was as if she was reading his mind, peeling away layers of his thoughts before he could even make sense of them. His breath caught in his chest as she continued. "You've been chosen," she said. "Fated to follow these rules. The rules that trap you. They're not just rules of this world. They're the rules of something much darker, much older, something that watches from beyond." Grayson's hands trembled on the steering wheel. How did she know? How could she know? He didn't speak, just kept his eyes on the road, though the streets seemed to blur and bend the longer they drove. It felt like they weren't just driving through a city anymore. It was something else, something unrecognizable. She didn't wait for him to ask questions. She spoke as though she had all the time in the world, as though she had been waiting to say these words for years. "The void," she murmured, almost to herself. "It's a place where the rules of reality don't apply, a place where nothing makes sense. And you, Grayson, you're trapped in it. You think this is real, that you're driving, that you're in control, but you're not." Her words sank into him like stones, weighing him down. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "The void," Grayson echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The void," Ivy repeated, her gaze still locked on him. "It's where the Watchers are. They see everything. They control everything. They've been watching you your whole life, watching you since you were a child. They've shaped your every move, your every thought, even your fears. You think you've made choices, but you haven't. Not really." Grayson's mind raced. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The fear was building now, turning his stomach into knots. He tried to steady his hands on the wheel, but it felt like he was holding on to something that was slipping further and further from his grasp. Was this some kind of twisted game? Ivy's voice cut through his thoughts, calm and certain. "Certain passengers come and go," she said, her tone almost detached. "Their purpose is part of something much bigger than you can comprehend. It's all connected. You're a piece of the puzzle, Grayson. A small part, but important enough to be watched. Chosen." "Chosen?" Grayson asked, his voice shaking now. "For what?" Ivy's lips curved into a small, knowing smile, but there was no warmth in it. "For the game. A game you didn't ask to play, but you're in it now. You'll never escape, not without consequences." His heart pounded louder in his ears. The car's hum was almost deafening now, and the world outside seemed to be falling apart at the edges, like a picture that was too blurry to see clearly. Was it all a game? Was it all just some twisted joke? The rules, the strange passengers, the shadow of the woman. It was all starting to feel like something much worse than coincidence. Ivy leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper, as though she were sharing something only he was meant to hear. "You'll never find the answers you're looking for, Grayson. The rules are meant to be broken, but you can't break them. Not ever." Her words hit him like a punch to the stomach, knocking the wind out of him. The weight of them lingered, pressing down on him like the car was sinking into the ground. He wanted to ask her more, wanted to scream, but he couldn't. The fear that had been building inside him was now a tight knot in his chest, choking him. As the car slowed to a stop, Ivy finally moved, her eyes still locked on his. She reached for the door without a word and stepped out of the cab, her movements slow and deliberate. Grayson didn't look away, not even when she closed the door behind her. He watched her walk away, her silhouette disappearing into the shadows of the street, and then the silence descended. It was deafening. The quiet was so complete it felt like the whole world had stopped moving. Grayson sat there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of her words hanging in the air, suffocating him. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring ahead at nothing. The world felt wrong now, unsettling, as if the very fabric of reality had been stretched too thin, ready to tear at any moment. His gaze drifted to the rearview mirror. He didn't expect to see anything, he never did, but this time, something felt different. His heart skipped a beat. The reflection of the empty backseat seemed off. It was subtle, just a flicker, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down his spine. There was something there, something watching him. Grayson's breath hitched as he stared at the rearview mirror, but when he looked back, there was nothing there. But that feeling of being watched, of being trapped, lingered. And he knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. It was just beginning. Grayson couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The chill in the air had settled deeper into his bones after Ivy left, and no matter how many times he checked the rearview mirror, the feeling of being watched remained, like invisible eyes tracking his every move. His hands gripped the steering wheel even tighter, knuckles white, as if holding on could keep him grounded in a reality that was slipping further away. It wasn't long before another figure appeared on the side of the road, this time more unexpected than any of the others. Grayson slowed the car as a man stepped forward, his uniform barely visible in the dim streetlight. The officer's face was calm, composed, but there was something in his eyes, a sharpness, an awareness, that made Grayson uneasy. He pulled over without thinking. The man opened the door and slid into the seat beside him. "Officer Cade Sinclair," he introduced himself, his voice low but confident. "I'm investigating a series of unusual incidents in this town. Strange things have been happening, and I think you might be able to help me piece it together." Grayson tried to maintain control, but the tightness in his chest made it hard to breathe. His instincts screamed that there was something off about this officer, something he couldn't place. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the sense of danger was growing with each passing second. Officer Sinclair wasn't just another passenger. "I've been following the patterns," Cade continued, his eyes never leaving Grayson's face. "There's something, or someone, that seems to show up at odd times, always at night, and I think you're more involved in this than you realize." Grayson swallowed hard, his pulse racing. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Cade's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, then back to Grayson. "I've heard stories, whispers from the people in town. There's something about certain people showing up at night, vanishing without a trace, leaving behind nothing but confusion. I'm starting to think it's all connected. All these strange occurrences, these passengers you pick up, they're not just random, are they?" Grayson's heart began to race, his mind spinning. He wanted to say something, wanted to ask how Cade could know, but the words stuck in his throat. He had no idea what was happening to him, no idea what these people wanted, but somehow, Cade seemed to know more than he should. "You're involved, whether you want to be or not," Cade said, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "And there's something bigger at play here, something that's been going on much longer than either of us can understand. Have you heard of the void?" Grayson's stomach twisted. He had heard the term before from Ivy, but he didn't know what it meant. "Not really." "The void," he repeated, his voice sounding small. Cade nodded, his face growing more serious. "I've been hearing things, more and more lately, people talking about it. There's a place, or maybe it's a state of mind where the rules of reality don't apply, and I think it's been leaking into this town, into your life." Grayson's head was spinning. The void, the whispers. He couldn't make sense of any of it, and the more Cade spoke, the more it felt like the walls were closing in around him. His thoughts were fractured, half-formed, and yet they were all leading to the same terrifying conclusion. None of this was a coincidence. Cade leaned in, his eyes narrowing, his voice lowering even further. I've seen things, Grayson. Things that make me question everything I've ever known. Shadowy figures following people. Voices that speak when no one's around. People disappearing. He paused for a moment, his gaze steady and searching. And I've heard your name in the whispers. People are watching you, but it's not just your passengers. It's something much worse. There's a pattern here, and I think you're at the center of it. Grayson felt the blood drain from his face, his hands slick with sweat. The air in the cab had grown heavier, almost suffocating. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The strange, twisted reality he was caught in seemed to be getting tighter with each passing moment. Cade was looking at him now, like he was trying to see into the very core of him. Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Cade didn't wait for him to speak. Instead, he dropped the bombshell that made Grayson's heart skip a beat. I've been investigating this for months. The Void isn't just a place. It's like a game. A game with rules that no one can break. The more we get closer to understanding it, the more dangerous things become. People who get too close, they vanish. Or worse. A chill ran down Grayson's spine. He wasn't sure if it was the officer's words or the reality of the situation finally sinking in, but something about Cade's tone made everything feel so much darker. You're part of this, Cade continued, his voice tinged with something Grayson couldn't place. You're playing a part in something much older than you realize. And trust me when I tell you this, you can't get out. Not without consequences. The rules are set. You're already trapped. Grayson's pulse thundered in his ears, the words almost too much to bear. His hands were shaking, his vision swimming as he tried to make sense of it all. He opened his mouth, but again, nothing came out. Cade's eyes softened just slightly, but the weight of his next words felt like a warning. You have to be careful, Grayson. Don't trust anyone, not even yourself. This game is much older than you realize. The officer straightened up, and before Grayson could respond, Cade opened the door and stepped out of the cab. He didn't say another word as he walked away, his figure disappearing into the fog that had started to creep in. Grayson sat there, frozen in place. The night had become heavier, more oppressive. The fog felt thicker now, as if it were closing in around him, suffocating him. He couldn't escape it, couldn't escape any of it. The weight of Cade's words pressed down on him, every part of him screaming for a way out. But no answer came. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breath. Grayson glanced in the rearview mirror again, his heart in his throat. But there was nothing. No shadowy figure, no strange figure in the back seat. Yet the feeling remained, the sense that he was being watched. The fog outside was thicker now, and Grayson knew, deep down, that the night was far from over. It had only just begun. The air in the cab felt suffocating, the silence pressing in on Grayson as he sat there, waiting for something, anything to break the tension. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even though he was alone. The fog outside seemed to cling to the windows like fingers trying to get inside, and every now and then the faintest whisper would brush against his ears, too quiet to understand, but loud enough to make his skin crawl. That's when he saw him. A figure stepped out of the mist on the side of the road. Grayson slowed down, a strange instinct telling him that this was the next person he was meant to pick up. As the man got closer, Grayson could see the haunted look in his eyes, eyes that seemed to pierce straight into Grayson's soul. He didn't say anything at first, just slid into the seat beside him, his presence overwhelming. "Ronan Pierce," the man said softly, his voice low and almost hypnotic. There was a weight to his words, like they carried some kind of dark gravity. "You've been wondering, haven't you? About all this, about them, the passengers, the fog, the void. You've been caught in a web, Grayson, and I'm here to tell you that you're not getting out." Grayson's heart skipped a beat. The way Ronan spoke made it sound like he knew everything, like he had been watching him for years. There was no denying it now. Something was terribly wrong, and Grayson was in deeper than he ever realized. "You think you have a choice," Ronan continued, his voice steady, as if he were speaking about something as simple as the weather. "But you don't. Not really. The rules, the ones you're following, they're not yours. You're just a pawn in a game you can't even begin to understand. Grayson's breath caught in his throat. His hands tightened on the wheel. What are you talking about? Who's controlling this? Ronan's eyes seemed to darken. You're part of something much bigger than you realize. The passengers? They're not just random people you're picking up. They're all part of a plan, a twisted design. And you've been playing your part without even knowing it. A cold shiver ran down Grayson's spine as the words sank in. He felt like his world was breaking apart, like the reality he thought he knew was crumbling to dust around him. But Ronan wasn't done. I've been part of this game for years, Ronan continued, his voice growing heavier with each word. I've seen how it works, how it twists everything around you. The void controls everything. It's inside you, Grayson. It's been inside you since the moment you started this job. The passengers you pick up, they're just pieces of the puzzle. The final one, the last passenger you're meant to take, that's when it all becomes clear. That's when you'll learn the truth. But trust me, you won't want to know it. Grayson's mind reeled. The last passenger? What did that even mean? Was he just supposed to keep picking up these people until some kind of grand revelation hit? Or was he trapped in this never-ending nightmare, forced to repeat it again and again until he lost himself completely? Ronan's eyes locked onto his, like he was seeing straight through him. You're already in it. The void is already inside you, Grayson. You can't escape it. It's in everything now. In the air, in your blood, in your mind. You've crossed a line, and there's no going back. Grayson felt a chill crawl up his spine, a freezing sensation wrapping around his chest. He wanted to say something, to ask what Ronan meant, but the words wouldn't come. There was a suffocating pressure in the air, like the walls of the car were closing in on him, pushing him further into the nightmare. Ronan didn't wait for him to speak. He leaned back in his seat, his expression softening for a moment, but the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. You're going to keep seeing them, Grayson. They'll keep coming, and you'll keep driving like a cog in a machine. It never ends. It just goes on, until you're consumed by it all. Grayson couldn't look away. He couldn't escape the feeling that Ronan was telling him something he was meant to hear, even if he wasn't ready for it. The car seemed to grow colder, the air thicker. His breath came out in shaky bursts as he glanced at the rearview mirror. Ronan's voice broke the silence again, this time more urgent. Don't try to run. You can't outrun the void. It's already inside you. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Grayson opened his mouth to say something, but before he could speak, Ronan was already opening the door. He stepped out into the thick fog without another word, his silhouette disappearing as the door clicked shut behind him. The car felt emptier now, quieter, but not in a peaceful way. The silence that followed was filled with a strange, unsettling tension, like something was waiting for him to make a move, something watching. And then, just as the sound of Ronan's footsteps faded into the darkness, Grayson heard it. The whisper. The same one he'd been hearing all night, the one that made his skin crawl. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, a soft, almost mocking voice that seemed to be calling him toward his fate. The temperature inside the car dropped even further, and Grayson could feel the weight of the unseen presence pressing in around him. He glanced again at the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. No shadow, no figure, nothing but the fog, thick and suffocating. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being drawn into something that he couldn't escape, was overwhelming. It was inescapable, and just like that, he knew the night was far from over. The void was coming for him, and this was just the beginning. The fog outside seemed thicker than ever, pressing in on the cab like a living thing. Grayson's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, but no matter how hard he tried to steady himself, he could feel the fear crawling under his skin. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The silence had grown heavier, like the world itself was holding its breath. And then she appeared. A woman stepped out of the fog, her figure almost glowing in the dim light of the street lamps. She moved with an unnatural grace, her long dark coat swaying with each step. The moment she opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, Grayson knew something was different about her. Her presence was magnetic, yet terrifying, like she didn't belong in the world he knew. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, it felt like she could see through him, right into the very core of who he was. "Mira Delacroix," she said softly, her voice smooth like silk, yet it carried an unsettling weight. "I've been waiting for you, Grayson." Grayson's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, waiting for me?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared out the window, as though watching something only she could see. The air inside the cab felt colder, the darkness outside pressing closer, wrapping around them like a shroud. "You're running out of time," Mira said, her voice low, each word deliberate. "The rules you've been following, they're about to change. The force that controls all of this, the void, it's getting closer. And when it comes, it won't be just the fog you need to worry about. It's everything. The game you've been caught in, it's collapsing. If you don't make a choice, you'll become part of it. You'll become part of the void." The words felt like they were sinking into Grayson's chest, tightening around his heart. He swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "What choice? What are you talking about?" Mira turned to look at him then, her eyes dark and knowing, as if she had seen this all before. "The passengers, the ones you've picked up, they aren't random. They're pieces of the puzzle, but you're the key. You're the one who will either destroy the puzzle or complete it. But you won't be the same. No one comes out of this unchanged." Grayson's mind raced. But what's the puzzle? What's the endgame here? Mira leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "You're part of a much larger plan, Grayson. A plan that's been in motion long before you ever picked up that first passenger. The rules you followed, the ones that made sense in the beginning, those rules are about to break. You can't escape what's coming. It's too late for that. But you can still make a choice. What you do next will decide everything." Grayson's head was spinning. The weight of her words was crushing him. The reality of what she was saying too much to grasp. The void, the passengers, the rules, it all felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "I've been watching you, Grayson," Mira continued, her voice growing colder now, as though she were speaking from some distant place. "I know what you've seen. I know what you're feeling. The fear, the confusion, the need to understand. But the truth is, you don't want to know everything. The last passenger you pick up, the one that will bring this all to an end, they're not someone you want to meet." Grayson's stomach twisted in knots. "Who are they? What do you mean by the last passenger?" Mira's eyes flashed with something dark, something Grayson couldn't quite place. "You'll know when they arrive, and when they do, you'll wish you hadn't been the one to answer that call." The words hung in the air between them, thick with menace. Grayson felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to look out the rearview mirror. He did, but there was nothing there, just more fog. But the feeling of something closing in on him was undeniable. Something was coming. He could feel it. Mira didn't wait for him to respond. She opened the door and stepped out into the fog, her movements swift and precise, as though she had already decided her part in all of this. But before she left, she turned back toward him, her eyes locking with his one last time. "Remember, Grayson," she said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "The choice is yours, but once you make it, there's no going back. The void will claim what it's owed, and you won't be able to outrun it. Not anymore." With that, she disappeared into the fog, her silhouette swallowed by the darkness. Grayson sat there, alone once more, the weight of her words sinking deep into him. The temperature inside the car had dropped even further, and he shivered, his breath clouding in the cold air. Something was wrong. He could feel it all around him. The darkness was closing in. He looked at the rearview mirror again, and this time he thought he saw something. A shadow, moving just outside the car. He blinked and it was gone. But the fear didn't leave. It never did. And then the whisper returned. It was faint at first, like a breath on the wind. But as it grew louder, Grayson could make out the words, though they sent a cold shiver crawling up his spine. "It's time." The voice wasn't coming from anyone in the car. It wasn't even coming from outside. It was coming from everywhere. From the shadows, from the fog, from the very air around him. Grayson's heart pounded in his chest as the temperature dropped to freezing. His mind raced. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew this wasn't just a bad night. This was the beginning of the end. Grayson's grip tightened around the steering wheel, his fingers stiff and cold. The fog outside had swallowed up the streetlights, and everything beyond the glass was an endless, suffocating blur. The voice was still there, echoing in his mind, and with every passing second, the chill in the car grew colder, as if the world was being drained of warmth. His heart thudded louder now, almost deafening, and a sickening feeling washed over him. Something was coming, something that would finally bring all of this to a terrifying conclusion. Then the door creaked open. Grayson's head snapped toward the sound, but all he saw was a figure stepping into the back seat. It wasn't like any of the passengers before. There were no details to cling to, no face, no clear outline, just a dark, shifting shadow that seemed to distort the air around it. The figure was there, yet not fully there. It was as if it existed in the space between reality and nightmare. A cold, suffocating darkness. Grayson couldn't breathe. He tried to speak, to ask who the passenger was, but the words caught in his throat. The shadow didn't respond. It just sat there, still, its presence overwhelming, as though it was waiting for him to understand. For what felt like an eternity, the car was silent, except for the faint, almost imperceptible sound of Grayson's labored breathing and the eerie hum of the engine. His mind raced. This was it. This was the end. He had picked up his final passenger, and now there was nowhere to run. Finally, the shadow spoke, its voice low and unnatural. It wasn't a voice, really. It was more like a whisper that came from everywhere and nowhere at once, a voice that seemed to slip into his very mind, bypassing his ears entirely. Grayson Holt, it said, and the name sounded wrong coming from the shadows, as though it had been twisted somehow. You've followed the rules. You've played your part. But now you will understand. Grayson's heart pounded faster, each beat echoing in his ears. What do you mean? What's going on? What is this? The shadow shifted slightly, and in its movement, Grayson felt the air grow heavier, as though gravity itself was changing. This is no accident, Grayson. You've been chosen. Your life has been a part of something far greater than you could ever imagine. A ritual, a game where only the chosen understand the true nature of the universe. But you have always been a player, and the game is coming to an end. Grayson's chest tightened as he tried to process the words. A game? Chosen? What are you talking about? Why me? Why any of this? The shadow seemed to grow even darker, its form shifting and flickering like a broken shadow cast by a flickering light. The passengers you've picked up, each one was a piece of a puzzle that you didn't even know you were putting together. Each one brought you closer to the truth. And now, here you are, at the final stage. Grayson wanted to scream, but the air in the car felt thick, like it was suffocating him, stopping his words before they could escape. The truth? What truth? What do you want from me? The shadow seemed to laugh, but there was no sound. It wasn't a laugh at all, but the unsettling feeling of something mocking him, pulling at the threads of his sanity. You've been part of something bigger than you, Grayson, the shadow whispered again, its voice growing colder. Your life, your choices, your every move, it's all been orchestrated, a test, a trial. And now you will see. You will finally know the truth. The temperature inside the car plummeted, and Grayson's breath came out in visible puffs. His hands were numb, his legs stiff. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The fear was paralyzing. You've been asking the wrong questions, Grayson, the shadow said, its voice now filling every inch of the car. The only question that matters is this: will you accept your fate, or will you resist? The words burned into his mind, swirling around like a vortex he couldn't escape. The shadow's presence grew heavier, suffocating, until Grayson could hardly breathe, his lungs fighting for air. But despite the terror, something in him, a dark, twisted part, began to understand. The game, the passengers, the rules. He was a part of something beyond his control, something that had been manipulating him from the very beginning. And now it was too late to escape. He could feel the pressure building inside him, the weight of his choices and his actions pressing down until there was nowhere to turn. The shadow had no answers for him, no comfort, only the cold, hard truth that he was nothing more than a piece in a game that was far older and more dangerous than he could ever comprehend. Your choice, Grayson, the shadow said one last time. Choose. Accept it, or become a part of it. The darkness inside the car grew so thick that Grayson felt like he was drowning. His heart hammered in his chest, his head spinning, his thoughts colliding in a chaotic rush of terror. He wanted to fight, to scream, to run, but his body betrayed him, frozen in place, helpless. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went still. The air was thick with tension, and Grayson felt his pulse quicken. He knew, he just knew, that his time had come. The choice had been made. There was no going back. With a sharp, jarring lurch, the taxi jerked forward, and Grayson felt himself being pulled, no, consumed, into something far darker than he could ever have imagined. The car wasn't on the road anymore. It was drifting, sinking, like a ship swallowed by the sea. And as the darkness closed in, Grayson heard the whisper again. It wasn't in his head this time. It was real, and it was the last thing he would ever hear. It's time. And then, nothing. The taxi disappeared into the void, leaving behind only the lingering silence, the kind that gnaws at the edges of your mind, making you wonder if you were ever really there at all.